Grandfather abandoned in nursing home. They even stole his entire retirement. He thought he was being cared for until he realized he was being kept silent behind locked doors. Documents were signed, accounts emptied, and his voice silenced by those who had sworn to protect him. But in the depths of that prison, a strength was born that no one imagined, and the truth could no longer be silenced. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll hear in your life. Anthony Foster, at 75 years old, gazed at the horizon from his small porch with the satisfaction of someone who had built every inch of that world with his own hands. The small farm, located on the outskirts of Pine Ridge in the mountainous region of Virginia, was the result of decades of work as a history teacher in public schools, savings made with almost religious rigor, and dreams shared with Cecilia, his wife of nearly 50 years, who had passed away 2 years ago after a long illness. The sky was beginning to take on the orange hues that announced the end of the afternoon when Richard's car parked on the dirt driveway. Anthony smiled at the sight, instinctively adjusting his flannel shirt, already faded by time. Richard had been visiting more frequently since Cecilia's passing, and this warmed the old teacher's heart. "Dad, I brought those medications you asked for and a few more things from the market," said Richard, carrying 2 plastic bags as he approached. At 42, he carried evident traits of Anthony: deep brown eyes, a firm chin, and the broad forehead that wrinkled when worried. Inside the simple but cozy house, Richard settled into the kitchen chair while Anthony prepared coffee. There was a different silence between them, the kind of silence that precedes difficult conversations. Finally, after the first sip of coffee, Richard began to talk about his concerns. "Dad, we need to talk about something important. I've been watching you here alone, taking care of everything. I'm worried." Anthony raised his gray eyebrows. "Worried about what, son? I've always taken care of everything around here." "Exactly. You've always taken care. But now you don't have the same energy. Last week when I came, I found you fallen near the chicken coop, remember? If I hadn't shown up..." The old teacher lowered his eyes to his cup. That episode embarrassed him, a simple dizzy spell that had knocked him down while feeding the chickens. Nothing serious, but enough to trigger the alarm in his son. "Richard, it was just a dizzy spell. No need to make a drama out of it." "It's not drama, Dad, it's reality. You're aging and need help. Living here alone isn't safe anymore. I've been thinking about some alternatives." Richard's alternatives sounded reasonable. Sell the farm, use the money to ensure a comfortable old age, move to a place where he could receive adequate assistance. He talked about powers of attorney, documents, transfers, joint accounts to facilitate the administration of resources. "That way, I could take care of everything for you, Dad. No worries, no complications. You deserve to rest after a lifetime." Day of work. There was something in Richard's eyes, a different shine, an unusual intensity, that Anthony couldn't decipher at that moment. Perhaps it was just the late afternoon light reflected in the kitchen windows, or perhaps it was the fatigue that was beginning to cloud his own judgment. In the following weeks, Richard's visits became more frequent and productive. Each time, he brought a new document to be signed, a new suggestion for change, a new financial arrangement that would facilitate the transition. Anthony, accustomed to trusting the son he had raised with so much love, signed the papers without questioning much, convinced that everything was for his own good. "You just need to sign here, Dad. It's a power of attorney so I can represent you in the procedures for selling the farm," explained Richard one April afternoon, extending a pen to his father. "And here are the bank cards and passwords. I'll keep everything safe and take care of your accounts, don't worry." Anthony's trust was absolute. After all, this was his son, his only heir, the boy he had taught to walk, to read, to respect others. The young man he had put through college with so much sacrifice, selling vegetables from the garden at farmers' markets to supplement his teacher's salary. The move happened on a May morning. Richard arrived early, accompanied by a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Monica, director of a residence for seniors in Thornville, the neighboring town. She spoke with a melodious voice about modern facilities, 24-hour medical care, recreational activities, and constant companionship with other seniors. Your son told us about your situation, Mr. Foster. We're prepared to welcome you and ensure you have all the comfort and security you deserve at this stage of life." Anthony hesitated. He hadn't discussed an immediate move with Richard. He thought they would still have. Weeks, perhaps months before the transition, he looked at his son, seeking explanations. "It's just for a short time, Dad," explained Richard, avoiding his gaze. "While we finalize the sale of the farm and find a permanent place for you, Serene Villa is perfect for this transition phase." "But what about my things? My books, your mother's photographs, my tools?" "I've already set aside the essentials. We can sort out the rest later. Trust me, Dad, it's for your own good." That same afternoon, with only 2 small suitcases containing some clothes and few personal belongings, Anthony left the farm where he had lived for more than 30 years. As he got into Richard's car, he looked one last time at the house, at the trees he had planted, at the small wooden bench where he used to sit with Cecilia on summer nights. A tightness in his chest told him something was wrong, but his son's voice sounded so confident, so sure. Serene Villa wasn't exactly as Dr. Monica had described. The 3-story building, painted a faded yellow, was located away from the town center, surrounded by a high wall with electric fencing. At the reception, a burly security guard controlled access through an electronic gate. The interior was clean but impersonal. Long corridors with numbered doors, walls in pastel tones, some artificial plant vases trying unsuccessfully to create a welcoming atmosphere. The room assigned to Anthony was small, with a single bed, a built-in wardrobe, a simple armchair, and a window that didn't open completely. "For security reasons," explained the employee who accompanied them. There was no telephone in the room, only an intercom for communication with the reception. "The seniors can receive and make calls on the community telephone in the common room, always under staff supervision," explained the woman, not noticing Anthony's look of discomfort. Richard stayed only long enough to accommodate his father's suitcases and fill out some forms in the administration. In his farewell, he hugged Anthony quickly, promising to return on the weekend. "I'll sort everything out, Dad, trust me. Soon we'll have a place just for you, much better than the farm. An apartment in town close to me, with all the assistance you need." When the door closed behind Richard, Anthony sat on the bed, suddenly feeling disoriented. The unfamiliar walls, the smell of disinfectant, the silence interrupted only by distant footsteps in the corridor. Everything seemed unreal, as if he had been transported to another world without his consent. The days at Serene Villa turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Anthony quickly learned the rules of the place: breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. Between meals, there were scheduled activities: card games, group physiotherapy sessions, screenings of old movies in the community room, all supervised by staff who, despite their formal kindness, maintained a calculated emotional distance. What disturbed Anthony most wasn't the rules or the routine, but the growing sense of isolation. Richard had promised weekly visits, but appeared less and less. First he cancelled due to work commitments, then because of car problems. Soon the excuses became vague, transmitted by Villa staff. "Your son called to let us know he won't be able to come today." On a Monday morning, after almost a month without news from his son, Anthony decided to use the community telephone to call Richard. He went to the common room, where an employee controlled access to the device. "Good morning, Ms. Helen. I'd like to make a call to my son." The middle-aged woman consulted a clipboard and frowned. "Mr. Foster, I don't see your name on the list of those authorized for external calls." "What do you mean? No one ever told me I needed authorization to make phone calls." "Those are the institution's rules, sir. External calls can only be made with prior authorization from the resident's responsible party." "But I am responsible for myself." Helen smiled condescendingly. "According to our records, your responsible party is your son, Richard Foster. He needs to authorize your external calls." Indignation quickly turned into suspicion. Something was wrong, very wrong. In the following weeks, Anthony tested other limits. He asked to go for a walk outside the villa's walls, requested his personal documents for verification, asked about the progress of the farm sale. Each request resulted in polite denials, evasive explanations, promises to consult management or forward the request to his responsible party. One afternoon, while organizing the small wardrobe in his room, Anthony found an envelope that had fallen behind the sock drawer. It was correspondence from the bank addressed to him, but already opened. The letter, dated 3 months earlier, informed about a significant transfer from his account to another, in Richard Foster's name. Anthony sat on the bed, trembling hands holding the paper. The truth was beginning to reveal itself with painful clarity. It was in this moment of vulnerability that he met Marina, a young staff member recently hired for the night shift. Unlike the others, she looked the residents in the eyes when talking. To them, asked about their lives before the villa, listened with genuine interest. For Anthony, it was like finding water in the desert. "You were a teacher, weren't you?" she asked one night, while helping him organize the few books he had managed to bring. "History, for more than 40 years. My grandfather was also a teacher. Mathematics. He used to say that teaching is the only profession that creates all others." Anthony smiled, the first sincere smile in months. "Your grandfather was a wise man." Marina hesitated for a moment, as if measuring her next words. "He's also in a place like this, not by his own choice." That confession created an instant bridge between them. On the following nights, they whispered during Marina's rounds. Anthony told her about the farm, about Richard's promises, about the bank letter found by chance. Marina listened with growing attention, her eyes revealing a mixture of compassion and indignation. "Mr. Foster, what happened to you?" "It's not right, not legal either. I suspect my own son deceived me, Marina, that he put me here to appropriate what was mine." "Do you have any friends outside? Someone trustworthy who could help?" Anthony thought for a moment. "Charles Miller. My college colleague, lifelong friend. We haven't spoken in a few months since I came here. He must be worried. Give me his contact. I'll try to help." 2 nights later, Marina entered Anthony's room after curfew, quietly closing the door behind her. Her face was tense, a mixture of fear and determination. "I managed to speak with Mr. Miller. He's very worried. He said he tried to visit you several times, but was always told you couldn't receive visitors or that you were in therapeutic activities." Anthony felt a wave of hope mixed with anger. Typical. They control everything here. "Mr. Miller wants to help you. He has hired a lawyer and is preparing everything to get you out of here legally." "How long will that take? Every day in this place I feel like I'm losing a piece of myself." Marina bit her lip. "Legal processes are lengthy, especially when they involve contesting powers of attorney and interdictions, but..." She looked at the door, lowering her voice even more. "There's another option." The plan was risky but simple. Marina worked alone on the Sunday night shift. The entrance security guard usually dozed off after midnight. Charles would be waiting, with a car 2 blocks from the villa. "If we get caught, you'll lose your job," warned Anthony. Marina smiled sadly. "Some things are more important than a job, Mr. Foster. My grandfather died in that place where they institutionalized him, without ever managing to get out. I can't let that happen again." On the agreed night, Anthony could barely contain his anxiety. He packed the small suitcase, putting in his few clothes and most precious personal objects. The watch Cecilia had given him on their wedding anniversary, some photographs, the diary he had started writing since his arrival at the villa. At 12:30 a.m. as agreed, Marina appeared. "Everything's ready. Joe is snoring at the guardhouse. Let's go through the service corridor." Anthony's heart was beating so hard that he feared the sound would alert the entire building. They followed the dimly lit corridor, passing through the empty laundry room, until they reached a metal door that led to the back of the property. "This door has an alarm during the day, but it's turned off at night for the early morning supply deliveries," explained Marina, pushing it slowly to avoid noise. The night air hit Anthony's face like a blessing. How long had it been since he had felt the free wind, without bars or tilting windows? Marina guided him through the back garden, skirting the wall until a point where an old tree projected branches beyond the fence. "The wall is lower here. There's a garden bench on the other side that makes it easier to descend. Can you climb?" For a 75-year-old man, the climb wasn't easy. His muscles, weakened by months of inactivity, protested with each movement. But determination overcame pain. With Marina's help, he managed to pass to the other side, landing with a muffled thud on the concrete bench. Follow this street to the second corner. Mr. Miller will be waiting in a blue Chevy, instructed Marina, still on the inside of the wall. Go. With God, Professor. And you, aren't you coming with me? I can't. If I disappear along with you, they'll connect the dots immediately. I need to go back and act normally until the end of my shift. This will give you a few hours advantage, before they notice your absence. Anthony felt his eyes well up. How can I thank you, Marina? Live your life, Professor. Recover what's yours. And when you succeed, tell your story. There are many others like you, silenced in places like the Villa. The walk down the deserted street seemed unreal. With each step, Anthony expected to hear sirens or shouts, but there was only the silence of the early morning, occasionally interrupted by the distant barking of a dog or the noise of a car passing on some nearby avenue. At the agreed corner, the blue Chevy waited with the engine running. When Anthony approached, the passenger door opened and the familiar face of Charles appeared, briefly illuminated by the vehicle's interior light. "My old friend," said Charles, his voice choked with emotion. Finally, in the back seat, a middle-aged woman smiled gently at Anthony. "Mr. Foster, I'm Dr. Beatrice Fields, attorney. We've been working on your case for a few weeks. It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person." As the car moved away from Serene Villa, Anthony felt a confused mixture of relief, fear, and indignation. He was free from those walls, but the road ahead seemed uncertain and frightening. "Where are we going now?" he asked, clutching the small suitcase against his chest. "To my home," replied Charles. "I have a guest room that I prepared for you. You can stay there as long as you need until we resolve this situation." What situation exactly? What happened to my farm, my things, my money? Charles and the lawyer exchanged concerned looks through the rearview mirror. "Anthony, I need you to prepare yourself," said Charles, slowing the car to be able to look directly at his friend. "The news isn't good." The guest room in Charles's house was simple but welcoming. A comfortable bed, a small desk by the window overlooking the backyard, shelves with history books, the specialty that both had shared since college days. For Anthony, after months at Serene Villa, that space represented an unimaginable luxury. Privacy, respect, freedom. The morning after the escape, Anthony, Charles, and lawyer Beatrice gathered in the kitchen to discuss the situation. Between sips of strong coffee, reality revealed itself in all its cruelty. "Richard sold the farm 3 months ago," explained Beatrice, consulting a folder of documents. "The money was transferred to the joint account you opened, and from there, practically the entire amount was moved to his personal accounts." Anthony felt as if each word was a stone falling on his chest. "And my savings? I had considerable savings, the fruit of years of work. Those were also transferred using the power of attorney that you signed. A very broad power of attorney, I must say, which gave Richard full powers to move your assets." Charles placed his hand on his friend's shoulder, feeling him tremble. "Anthony, you need to understand that your son not only appropriated your assets, he tried to have you legally declared incompetent, claiming mental incapacity." "Mental incapacity?" Anthony's voice rose an octave. "I'm a retired university professor. I taught until I was 70. Beatrice nodded gravely. "That's why we're able to contest the interdiction. I've obtained reports from your university, colleagues, testimonies from former students, and will request a new independent medical examination. But that takes time." "Time is what I have the least of, Beatrice. I'm old, tired, and I've just discovered that I was betrayed by my own blood." "You have more time and strength than you imagine," replied the lawyer firmly. "And now you have the law on your side. What Richard did constitutes several crimes: embezzlement, fraud, indirect false imprisonment, since he kept you in the villa, against your will." The following days were a whirlwind of activities. Beatrice initiated legal proceedings, obtained emergency injunctions, scheduled examinations. Charles accompanied his friend at each step, offering not only transportation and shelter, but the emotional support that Anthony so desperately needed. A week after the escape, while having coffee on the back porch, Charles brought a small digital recorder. "Anthony, remember what Marina said about telling your story?" The old professor nodded, watching a hummingbird visiting the flowers in the garden. "I thought we could start recording your memories, not just what happened with Richard and the villa, but your entire journey, your childhood in West Virginia, college years, marriage to Cecilia, your career as an educator, a whole life that deserves to be preserved." The suggestion touched something deep in Anthony. During months at Serene Villa, he had felt as if he were disappearing, his identity dissolving among the imposed routines and isolation. The idea of recovering his story, of affirming his existence through words, was like rediscovering a treasure he thought was lost. The recordings began that same afternoon. Initially hesitant, Anthony soon found pleasure in revisiting his memories, organizing them into narratives that Charles meticulously recorded. It was therapeutic, a way to reconnect with himself while the legal proceedings followed their slow course. On a Tuesday morning, after almost a month of legal battles, Beatrice arrived with news. Her normally serious face displayed a contained smile. "We've secured the revocation of the power of attorney and a precautionary measure freezing what remained in Richard's accounts," she announced, extending official documents. "We haven't recovered everything yet, but it's a start. The judge has also ordered the immediate return of your personal documents." Anthony held the papers, feeling their symbolic weight. "And what about Serene Villa?" "We're suing the institution for false imprisonment and negligence. Preliminary investigations indicate it's not the first case. There are other families reporting similar situations." The mention of other victims made Anthony think of Marina and her grandfather, who hadn't managed to escape. "We need to do something. For these people, Beatrice, I can't simply go on with my life knowing that others remain imprisoned as I was." It was Charles who suggested transforming the recordings into a podcast. His nephew, Matthew, worked with audio production and had a small online platform. Untold Stories, the project was called, with Anthony narrating not only his experience, but reflecting on aging, dignity, and the rights of the elderly in America. The first episode aired 3 months after the escape from the villa. The response was surprising. Hundreds of comments, shares, other seniors reporting similar experiences. Journalists began to make contact. An investigative reporter from a major newspaper proposed a series of reports on nursing homes and rest homes that functioned as disguised prisons. While his voice gained reach, Anthony continued the personal struggle to rebuild his life. With Beatrice's help, he managed to open a new bank account and recover part of his savings. The money from the sale of the farm, however, had almost completely disappeared. Richard had invested it in failed businesses, trying to quickly multiply the value. "He was always impulsive with money," Anthony commented sadly during one of the recordings. "As a child, he would spend his allowance on the first day. As an adult, he was always trading cars, taking on long financing. He always lacked the patience to build gradually, as Cecilia and I did." The mention of his wife still brought a lump to his throat. Would Cecilia have noticed Richard's intentions? Would she have prevented everything from happening? These questions tormented Anthony on sleepless nights. One afternoon, while organizing some books that Charles had rescued from the farm before the sale, Anthony found a yellowed envelope inside an old edition of Mark Twain. It was a letter from Cecilia, written during her final hospitalization, addressed to him. How had he never seen it before? Probably Richard had placed it there, sometime between his mother's passing and his father's institutionalization. With trembling hands, Anthony opened the envelope. "My dear Anthony," the letter began in Cecilia's delicate handwriting, "if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer physically by your side. There are things I need to tell you, which I may not have managed to express personally in recent days." The letter was long, filled with the love and wisdom that had always characterized Cecilia. It spoke about the life they had built together, about the values they had tried to transmit to their son, about the dreams they had realized and those left behind. In the last lines, there was a warning. "I'm worried about Richard, my love. In recent months during my hospitalizations, I've noticed changes in him. A greed I've never seen before, insistent questions about our assets, about the farm, about our savings. Perhaps it's just insecurity in the face of my imminent departure, but I ask you to be careful. Our son has always had a good heart, but I fear he's getting lost in ambitions that were never ours." Anthony let the letter fall onto his lap, tears blurring his vision. Cecilia had noticed. She had tried to warn him. And now, months later, her words finally reached him. Too late to prevent the betrayal, but perhaps in time to understand its roots. That night, after a silent dinner with Charles, Anthony decided he needed to speak with his son. Not for revenge or confrontation, but to understand, to try to recover, if possible, something of the relationship he thought was so solid. "Are you sure, Anthony?" questioned Charles, concerned. "Richard is still under criminal investigation. Beatrice advised maintaining distance until the conclusion of the proceedings." "I'm too old to wait for the justice of men, my friend. I need answers now while I still have the clarity to understand them." The next day, with Beatrice's reluctant agreement, Anthony asked Charles to mediate a meeting with Richard. The chosen location was neutral, a coffee shop in the town center, a public space that would ensure safety for both. Richard arrived punctually, looking aged and nervous. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting suit, very different from the elegant clothes he used to wear. His eyes, so similar to Anthony's, avoided direct contact. "Dad," he murmured, sitting in the opposite chair, "I didn't expect... The lawyers said not to talk to you during the process." Anthony observed his son for a long moment before responding. He saw in him not only the traitor who had confined him to Serene Villa, but also the boy he had carried on his shoulders, the teenager he had taught to drive, the young man he had emotionally embraced on his graduation day. "I didn't come as your accuser, Richard. I came as your father who's still trying to understand how we reached this point." What followed was a painful conversation, full of awkward silences and disturbing revelations. Richard spoke about hidden debts, failed investments, an expensive divorce he had hidden from his parents. He talked about the temptation to solve everything at once with the money from the sale of the farm, convincing himself that he would be helping his father by securing him a place at Serene Villa. "I thought I could quickly multiply the money, pay my debts and still secure your future, Dad. But everything went wrong. The investments depreciated, creditors increased the pressure. I entered a spiral of desperation, and you left me to rot in that institution, without contact, without freedom, without dignity," completed Anthony, his voice firm despite the pain. Richard lowered his eyes, unable to sustain his father's accusing gaze. "At the beginning, I really believed it would be temporary. Later I was ashamed, afraid. Each day that passed made it more difficult to face what I had done." "Your mother saw this coming," said Anthony, taking Cecilia's letter from his pocket and placing it on the table. "She tried to warn me." Richard held the letter with trembling hands, immediately recognizing his mother's handwriting. As his eyes scanned the lines, tears began to fall, staining the paper already yellowed by time. "She always saw beyond appearances," he murmured, carefully folding the letter and returning it to Anthony. "She always knew when I was lying, even when I thought I was being convincing." A heavy silence settled between father and son. Around them, the coffee shop continued its normal routine. Waiters circulated between tables, customers chatted animatedly, the espresso machine hissed in the background. It was as if they existed in a private bubble of pain and regret, invisible to others. "What happens now, Dad?" Richard finally broke the silence, his voice low and uncertain. Anthony breathed deeply, feeling the weight of that question. It was the same one he himself had asked countless times during his sleepless nights at Charles's house. Legally, the process continues. Beatrice is committed to recovering as much as possible of what was lost and holding accountable those who should be held accountable. That includes you and Serene Villa. Richard nodded, accepting the inevitability of the consequences. "And personally, between us two." "That's more complicated," replied Anthony, studying his son's face. "You destroyed a trust built over an entire lifetime. You betrayed not only me, but also your mother's memory, the values we tried to teach you." I know an apology isn't enough." "No, it's not," interrupted Anthony firmly. "But it can be a beginning. What you do after making a mistake, Richard, is what will define who you really are." That meeting, painful as it was, opened a small crack for something new between father and son. It wasn't forgiveness, it was still too early for that, but it was a possibility, a space for something different to grow from the ruins of what had been destroyed. In the following weeks, while the legal proceedings followed their course, small changes began to happen. Richard appeared at Charles's house with a box of old photographs he had managed to recover before the sale of the farm. On another occasion, he brought the old wall clock that had belonged to Cecilia's parents, an object without great monetary value but loaded with emotional significance for Anthony. "I managed to recover it from the farm buyer," he explained, delivering the carefully wrapped clock. "I explained the situation and he agreed to return it. I paid for it, of course." "With what money?" asked Anthony, suspicious. "I thought you had lost everything." Richard hesitated before answering. "I sold my car. I'm using public transportation now." This small sacrifice, more than any words, began to pave the way in Anthony's hardened heart. It didn't erase what had been done, but signaled a genuine disposition for reparation. Meanwhile, the Untold Stories podcast gained more and more listeners. What had begun as a personal therapeutic project transformed into a movement for the dignity of the elderly. Anthony daily received messages from people who identified with his story or who sought guidance for similar situations. A university professor of elder law, touched by the accounts, invited Anthony for a lecture at her college. Despite initial apprehension, it had been years since he had spoken in public. He accepted. The amphitheater was packed. Law students, social workers, health professionals, and mainly seniors and their families. "Aging in America is an act of resistance," Anthony began, his voice initially trembling but gaining firmness as he advanced. "Our society values youth, productivity, novelty. When we become old, we are often treated as burdens, as problems to be managed, not as people with stories, desires, and rights." The audience listened in respectful silence, many nodding in recognition. "My story is not unique. It's just one, among thousands of similar stories that happen every day, often in silence behind high walls and closed doors. What makes it different is that I'm here to tell it." After the lecture, during the question session, a woman of approximately 60 stood up. "Mr. Foster, your story deeply moved me. I'm an editor at Luminary Press specializing in social issues. I'd like to invite you to transform your experiences into a book. I believe it could help many people and contribute to changing the way our society sees and treats the elderly." The proposal caught Anthony by surprise. A book. He had never considered that possibility. The recordings for the podcast were one thing: informal conversations, spontaneous reflections. A book would require organization, structure, a much greater commitment. "I would need help," he responded hesitantly. "I've never written anything besides academic articles, and that was decades ago." "We can provide a co-author, someone who works with you to structure the material," suggested the editor. "We have several experienced professionals who—" "I can help," interrupted a familiar voice. Richard was standing at the back of the auditorium. "If my father allows it." A murmur ran through the audience. Many there knew the complete story through the podcast and were aware of Richard's role in the betrayal. Anthony felt all eyes turn to him, waiting for his reaction. "My son has a degree in business administration, not in literature," he finally said, a slight smile appearing at the corner of his lips. "But he's always had a way with words. He got that from his mother." That's how the most ambitious and unexpected project of Anthony's life began. 3 times a week, he and Richard met in the small living room of Charles's house to work on the manuscript. The son typed while the father dictated, interspersing old memories with reflections on the present and analyses of the rights of the elderly in America. The process wasn't easy. There were moments of tension, loaded silences, painful memories that needed to be confronted. Richard frequently interrupted the typing, overwhelmed by guilt when hearing his father describe the months at Serene Villa. We can skip this part. If you prefer, offered Anthony on one of these occasions, noticing his son's discomfort. No, replied Richard firmly. We need to tell everything. I need to face what I did. Gradually, those writing sessions transformed into a peculiar process of reconciliation. Between paragraphs and chapters, between corrections and revisions, father and son rebuilt a relationship that seemed irreparably destroyed. It wasn't the same relationship as before. It could never be. It was something new, more complex, marked by deep scars, but also by an honesty that had never existed previously. Richard spoke openly about his weaknesses, his mistakes, his fears. Anthony, in turn, revealed vulnerabilities he had always hidden, trying to be the strong and unshakable father. Your mother always told me that I should be more open with you, confessed Anthony during a pause in the writing. That I tried to protect you too much, not showing my own difficulties and doubts. I thought you were never afraid of anything, replied Richard. That you always knew exactly what to do. Anthony laughed softly. I was terrified most of the time. When you were born, I looked at that tiny being and thought, how am I going to protect this child in such a difficult world? When you had that high fever at 3 years old, I spent the entire night praying, negotiating with God, promising anything if you would get better. These revelations, these small shared truths, were as important as the major, legal and financial issues that continued to be addressed in the courts. While Beatrice achieved legal victories, holding Serene Villa accountable, partial recovery of assets, annulment of the interdiction, father and son conquered small personal victories in each page written together. 6 months later, the manuscript was completed. Walls of Silence, a story of betrayal, resistance and reconstruction in old age, would be published by Luminary Press with a launch scheduled for the International Day of Older Persons. On the eve of the launch, Anthony asked Charles to take him to the cemetery where Cecilia was buried. He brought fresh flowers, the yellow daisies she had so loved, and spent almost an hour sitting beside the grave, talking in a low voice, as if she could hear him. I think I finally understood what you always tried to teach me, my love, he said, caressing the marble headstone. That forgiving isn't forgetting what was done, but choosing not to let it define the future. Richard is trying, Cecilia. He's not perfect, he makes mistakes, but he's trying, as we all always did. The book launch attracted many more people than the small bookstore could accommodate. Journalists, students, professionals in the field of gerontology, podcast fans and mainly seniors, many accompanied by children and grandchildren, formed a line that extended down the block. When the time came for Anthony to speak, an expectant silence took hold of the environment. He looked at the attentive faces before him, feeling the weight and responsibility of that moment. This book was born from pain, but also from hope, he began, his voice clear despite his age. It was born from betrayal, but also from reconciliation. It was born from forced silence, but transformed into a cry for dignity. It's not just my story. It's the story of thousands of American seniors who daily struggle to maintain their autonomy, their voice, their humanity. He paused, looking for Richard with his eyes. He was standing, discreetly, in a corner of the bookstore. I want to thank my son, Richard, who had the courage to face his mistakes and work to repair them, who understood that our story, with all its flaws and fractures, deserved a chance to continue. A contained, respectful applause followed these words. Richard lowered his eyes, visibly moved. Aging is not a tragedy. It's a privilege denied to many, continued Anthony. The real problem isn't in the wrinkles, the physical limitations, or the diseases that may arise. It's in the way our society treats those who age, denying them voice, choice, and dignity. After the event, when most guests had already left, Richard approached his father with a small box in his hands. I have something for you, he said, extending the present. It's not much, but inside the box was a key and an envelope. Anthony looked questioningly at his son. It's the key to a small apartment downtown, near the square you always liked, explained Richard. It's nothing fancy, but it has an elevator, 24-hour doorman, and it's close to everything. The envelope contains the rental contract. It's in your name. I got a good price negotiating directly with the owner, a former client of mine. Richard, I can't accept. With what money did you... I sold the land I bought in Ocean City a few years ago, the one I always said would be for building my beach house when I retired. He smiled sadly. I realized there are more important things than plans for a distant future, like doing what's right now. Anthony observed his son for a long moment, seeing in him not only the mistakes made, but also the genuine effort of reparation, the search for redemption. The apartment is also close to my house, continued Richard hesitantly. I thought that maybe we could see each other more frequently, if you want, of course. That night, in his room at Charles's house, Anthony reflected on the extraordinary journey of recent months, from the disguised prison at Serene Villa to reclaimed freedom, from despair to hope, from betrayal to the possibility of forgiveness. He took the old diary he had begun during the dark days at the institution and opened it to a blank page. With the pen Cecilia had given him on their last birthday together, he wrote, "It wasn't about revenge, it was about remembering who I am. And perhaps in the process of retelling my story, I helped my son rediscover who he can be." He closed the diary, carefully storing it in the drawer of the bedside table. Tomorrow would be the first day in his new apartment. A new chapter was about to begin, not only in the book he had just launched, but in his own life. And this time it would be he who would write each page with a firm pen in hand and recover dignity in his heart. Dear listeners, we hope Anthony's journey has touched your hearts. To continue this emotional experience, we've prepared a special playlist with equally moving stories. Find it here clicking on the left. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like on the video. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the